I'm the curator at Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse, and today we're going to talk to you about our BioBlitz event and how that kind of fits in with the site's wider aims as a Gressenhall Environment Hub, as well as a workhouse museum and rural life or Norfolk life museum. So first you'll hear from Ben, who is the Environment Learning and Outreach Officer at Gressenhall, and he'll put the event in a bit of context for our wider aims. Then to Fiona Ashley, who is our events officer, and then finally I'll talk about kind of some of the longer term legacy in terms of interpretation of the event. So we're going to talk for like 15 minutes and then hand over for questions and chat. So please, if you think of anything as we're going along, you can pop it in the chat maybe, and then we'll throw it open. So yep, over to Ben.
Thanks, Rach. Yeah, so if we could roll on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so to give you a little bit of context, Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse, we're a rural museum in mid-Norfolk, and the Environment Hub was set up about 4 years ago as a partnership between the Museum Service and the Environmental Services of the County Council, with a core aim of communicating the County Council's environmental policy and strategy. And it's sort of grown from there to be really focused on trying to support communities to create grassroots projects and initiatives that help create a better environment in and around Norfolk. And we do that through a variety of ways. You can see in the photos here pictures of volunteers at our tree nursery, school groups that come to visit us, and we also have public event days. But it's also really important for an environment hub to, I suppose, practice what it preaches. And so one of the things that I started on quite soon after joining the role was to start up the green team at the museum, which had laid dormant for a few years. And one of the green team's main pieces of work in the past had been something called the Biodiversity Action Plan. So if you could pop that up for me, Rach, thank you. So this is the front page of the action plan as it stands today. You can see it's dated from last year, which is when we started updating it. This is a document that contains within it the history of habitat management over the past decades, what we've tried to do to improve the site for nature. And since updating it, we have started to put in some really specific, achievable goals that we want to carry out to increase biodiversity. But of course, you have to be able to test these things. And so we realized we needed to, in some way, collect survey information about the animals and plants living on our site. So Rach, if you could roll on to the next slide. Thank you. So just to give you an idea of how complicated the site is in terms of trying to survey it, we're both really well placed for a BioBlitz because of our size and because of the fact that most of the site is outdoors, but also it's a huge amount of habitats and lots of different ways of surveying and lots of micro habitats really that are going to vary a lot across the site. So you can see we've got farmland, we've got more formal gardens and vegetable gardens, we've got wildflower meadows, orchards, and we've also got woodlands. And so very, very suited to the site, but also a really, really complicated thing to do, a BioBlitz in such a big site. So it's probably worth me explaining a little bit about what a BioBlitz is. So Rach, if you could go to the next slide for me. So to keep things easy for myself, I just got it on the slide, but I'll read it out for you all. A BioBlitz is a 24-hour event. It can sometimes be 48 hours, in which teams of volunteer scientists, families, students, teachers, and other community members work together to find and identify as many species of plant, animals, and fungi as possible. So our aim was to create a public event that helped us create a baseline for our biodiversity action plan. So we knew what we had here, and therefore in the following years, if we saw new species, we'd know that some of the things that we put in place were helping encourage those species. But it's also a really great way of getting the general public involved, because you design a BioBlitz to be something that can be carried out by amateurs, as it were. The two organisations that you can see on the screen here are the National BioBlitz network, which we spoke to about ways in which we could join this up with data that's collected nationally, and NBIS on the left-hand of your side of your screen, which is the Norfolk Biodiversity Information Service. Now, all counties will have something akin to the Norfolk Biodiversity Information Service, and that service is responsible for centralising all of the records of all of the species seen around a given county. These two organisations were really, really helpful, especially NBIS in the early days, in trying to work out who it was we needed to speak to be able to leverage expertise within the county and get the experts there to help us and the public during the event. So, Rach, if you could go on to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about how we did that. So, the photograph of me and a big television screen in a room of people on the top right of your screen, that was one of the first events we did in connection to the BioBlitz. It was a Recorders Day. So every county will have a team of county recorders, sorry. They're volunteers who work on specific species or specific genuses and groups of animals, recording and tracking their progress within the county. And so what we wanted to do is create a little day out for them where they could come and collect on our site and have a little poke around, which is something that naturalists like to do, but also get some buy-in with them and say to them, would you like to come along to our event, be an expert for the day, show people how this is done, and get them inspired to help support biodiversity. We also work closely with a secondary school who we have a working after-school club with. They're on the left-hand side of the screen, and they came and helped run a pilot with our county recorders. So the county recorders came along and we ran a sort of mini BioBlitz with this one group of about 12 students. And we used all of the resources that Fiona and Rachel will show you in a minute, just to test how they worked and make sure everything was running smoothly. I should mention as well at this point, because I completely forgot, we were lucky enough to apply for a grant to go towards this event. So we had a commitment as part of that grant to find a new partner to work with. And it just so happened that we had a partner in mind, which was the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society. They are comprised of a lot of the county recorders I mentioned earlier and other experts in the county, and they will publish documents about wildlife within the county, but they're also very much about public engagement and getting people inspired by nature. So this was a really nice way of us providing them a place to do that and to share their expertise. You know, a site that's set up for that. We've got toilets, we've got, you know, all the sorts of things you might want for engaging large groups of people. And the idea was that this would become the beginning of an ongoing relationship. Finally, at the bottom left-hand of the side of the screen, you can see one of the ways we tried to promote this event, because we really wanted to focus on secondary school children and families. And obviously, as many of you will know, secondary school children have been notoriously hard to reach. So we did a competition with Norwich Science Week to win tickets to the BioBlitz, and we also gave out free tickets to 2 of the local high schools to try and really target that audience. I'm going to hand over to Rachel and Fiona now so they can tell you a little bit about the event itself.
Thanks, Ben. So I'll just wait for myself to come up on speaker mode. I don't know if that's just showing for me but not for you, or vice versa. I can just still see Ben. Either way, hopefully you'll be able to spot me. In terms of the event itself, Ben's already given you an introduction to our partners, and if any of you are unfamiliar with BioBlitzes, just to confirm that yes, typically a 24 to 48-hour event. Ours we ran in public opening time. We were not here for 24 hours. That's the type of logistics I think that our site operationally would really struggle to manage, as I'm sure so many of your own known sites might too. So from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m, which is when our site is open, visitors were welcome to come, participate, take part. And as part and parcel of the event, we actually used the kind of roadmap of the pilot with the local high school and the recorders in certain habitat stations, and we expanded it. And we made those habitat stations fixed across our site, and also paired them with a couple of additional activities. So I'll quickly run through, and then we'll also show you a map, which hopefully gives a bit of a better idea of how to visualize what people were doing on the day. So as well as habitat stations, each staffed by at least one recorder and also some local independent birders on our bird station, we also had an orientation station to begin with. Our site is 50 acres, meaning that sometimes folks will come and have a very clear idea of what it is, where they want to go next, making their way directly to the cafe, the gift shop, or the playground. But others might come in, stumble across an event they didn't know was happening and needed a bit of additional support. So for all of the audiences, as soon as they got into the courtyard, they were welcomed with the smiling face of Rachel, who you can see in that centre photograph, who was able to give more context to the event we were running for anyone who was unfamiliar with a BioBlitz, and get people set up with everything they needed to be able to take part. So one of the key things about the data collection, which Rachel will sum up later about how that's impacted on the end of this project, how it's helped us. The data collection on the day, we recognise that our visitors, by and large, mostly will have smartphones in the day and age that we're in, but simultaneously, we didn't want to make it exclusionary to anyone who doesn't prefer to use a phone. So the key way in which we were collecting some data, well, I suppose it had three strands. We had our recorders themselves who were at each of these stations, and people were encouraged to go to each station, get a bit, of information from whoever was there about the species and types of animals, insects, amphibians, birds, etc. they might be expecting to find. But then also to take that list and to encourage them to use iNaturalist, which is the app that broadly the national BioBlitz network use. So we could try and connect all that data nationally. And then additionally, we also gave a handout, which I will ask Rachel in a moment to skip over to, so that people could respond organically and in an analog way, just to write their findings down, to draw, to respond however they preferred. And we also collected as many of those in as we could. Those also gave incentive for folks to be able to find each of the stations, both through the use of the map of the site and also through collecting stamps. And people are completionists. They really love to be able to, get something complete. So that was a really nice way to encourage folks to get to each and every one of these different various habitat stations, which were quite spread out. And then the additional activity we had as a pyrography workshop, a personalised pyrography flower press workshop, which also focused on sustainable foraging and how to, gain species and specimens from your walks in the wild, to do so responsibly, to do so, as a bit of a beginner's guide, hoping that people empowered and armed with their new bit of kit, their personalised flower press that they designed themselves, could then use that whilst kind of connecting to nature outside of our site, but as a nice friendly reminder of our site. And then also pictured is one of our teaching museum trainees, Lucy, who ran an activity specifically about some of the harder species to spot on the day-to-day, e.g. mammals, small mammals, which we knew would be harder to represent in a habitat station and would leave some of our smaller friends visiting the museum feeling quite despondent if they didn't see a rabbit on the day. So we were able, through some of our historic taxidermy selections and through some various Environment Hub species representation, replicas and otherwise, to give a bit of engagement there too. Are you happy to move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And just to show the kind of idea of what the visitors were using on their roundabout way, engaging in the BioBlitz and across the site, the iNaturalist app screenshot taken on the left-hand side of a meadow grasshopper that was captured on the day by one of our visitors. And the BioBlitz sheet itself, you can see some of the additional capture I mentioned before in terms of a bit more of an analog option. So ways that people could record without having to be on a phone if they wanted to go tech-free. And we were really lucky to get some fantastic feedback as well as a result. We welcomed over 300 people to our BioBlitz, and it was a really lovely audience of some folks who clearly were very, very adept at their own kind of natural recordings, were perhaps already attending BioBlitzes elsewhere, and some folks who had never heard of one before still pitched in, got involved and had a fantastic time. And we had some really, really lovely engagements across the day, both from our recorders who said how much they enjoyed working with the public, something that they don't always necessarily do, but also from our visitors who had, I think, a really wonderful introduction for many as to how you can support nature on a local basis in a really fun, free, free-ranging, I suppose, led but not prescriptive way, if that makes sense, while still being really respectful and sensitive to the needs of nature around us whilst trying to record it. I'll hand over the mic to Rach.
Great. So in terms of the wider aims of Gressenhall Environment Hub, we're trying to slowly integrate some environmental stories within kind of the more permanent interpretation we have at the museum as a Museum of Norfolk Life and Rural Life Museum. So we were lucky enough that we could build into this grant that we got money to engage a designer, an illustrator, and print some new panels, which we kind of followed almost exactly the habitat stations that we had on the BioBlitz. Now, in most of those spaces, you will find a panel about the kind of habitat there. Some of them will be new ones that will go up on kind of wooden lecterns that our volunteers are making, which are much cheaper than the metal lecterns that unfortunately our grant didn't stretch to. And in some cases, we're going to be using a vinyl wrap to update existing interpretation, like the Wildflower Meadow one you can see there. So, I mean, obviously, as well as getting the data about our site, the BioBlitz itself directly fed into the interpretation in two ways. So firstly, the data we looked at helped us understand what pieces of wildlife or species our visitors were likely to see. For example, lots of people recorded grasshoppers in the wildflower meadow. So that's a great one to highlight so that visitors might actually spot one while they're out and about at the same time. Secondly, we used the BioBlitz event as a kind of informal consultation about what people found interesting about habitats and habitat species. So firstly, at all points we were working with Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society, we sort of would ask them to say, well, what about, biodiversity story do you think is really interesting about this site? What would you talk about? And on the sheets that people went round and did their BioBlitz on the day, there was like a little section to draw, like draw your top 5 things. So that just helped to give me an idea about what things people find interesting. I'll just show you a few more. And we definitely wouldn't have included lichen if it wasn't for our enthusiasm from Norwich and Norfolk Naturalist Society, because who would have known lichen was so fascinating? I didn't until then. So with the aims of the interpretation, we wanted to be engaging and family friendly as our site is, but not something that maybe looks entirely for children. So hence, we've still got a fair amount of text on there, although we did keep to under 200 words. But that's why we went for these illustrations over photographs. And I think they age better as well, actually. We wanted it to be a recognisable group of panels. So these are spread quite far and wide, or they will be quite far and wide across the site. But we've used the same colours and the same sort of branding, slightly different to our normal branding, but still recognisable. So the idea is that as people wander around our rural landscape, they will start to spot these and therefore maybe start thinking about where they are in terms of biodiversity and habitats, as well as a rural landscape and farming landscape, so how those two things fit together. In the text, we try to include stories that highlight the relationship between humans, actions and biodiversity, but mostly kind of positive action stories rather than, maybe some of the negative aspects. So we talked about woodlands requiring active management and how you can thin overhead canopies to encourage smaller flowers to grow, that sort of thing. And as you can probably see, in each space, we highlighted a spotlight species, species that are typically found in that habitat, but also ones that maybe relate quite specifically to that habitat. For example, on this other one, on the wildflower meadow, we talked about the cinnabar moth and how it's a caterpillar specifically eats a flower called ragwort, so that links very specifically to a wildflower meadow. And just quickly to say, really, this more permanent interpretation fits in with some of our temporary exhibitions over the last few years as well. So we try, we have one temporary exhibition a year, but we try every so often to look at one that is environment themed. This one was from Access to Acorns, Woodlands and How We've Shaped Them. So we were able to incorporate some of our very you know, kind of traditional as you would expect to find in a rural life or rural museum collection, objects around forestry and hedge relaying, but we linked those into a story about how people have shaped woodlands and trees over millennia, right from the Ice Age to the modern day, and technology like this tree talker in the bottom left, which is used to try and track diseases in trees and treat them early on. So it's all part of a big story at Gressenhall. Back to Ben.
Yeah, so just to quickly finish up before we go to some questions, what is next? Obviously, we went into this wanting to gather data, and we've now got a really lovely problem, which is a vast amount of data, some of it quite messy, that we need to turn into something useful. And so this has really been a springboard for us to look into setting up a new volunteer program focused on surveying the site's biodiversity. So we're going to set up a volunteer team, and that team will be very much community based. We want to work with people living in the surrounding villages, and we are hoping that it will become what I'm referring to as a soft border to something called the Wendling Beck Environment Project, which is an environmental project, very much a business in its own right, next door to the museum, that is bringing marginal farmland back to a wild status. And we want to be able to create a community around the museum that is involved in allowing that work to spill out of that project into the surrounding villages. Okay, that's it. Any questions?
Great. So over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for a really rich and interesting description and discussion of the day, but also how it fits in that broader context. Don't know if anyone has any queries that they'd like to raise or examples. Catherine, or I might need to take you off mute. Hang on. Let's see.
I've got a question in the chat while you do that, Hannah, if that's all right. Shall I do that? So Sally was just asking who the grant was from. So yeah, that was from our local museum development service, Share, which is now Museums Development South East. And they had a program called Environmentally Responsible Museums. So we got, I think, just over £3,000 to do that, but that did include all the design and interpretation work, which ate up quite a lot of budget, as you imagine. But that gave us the extra kind of leeway to do proper pilot events and, you know, try it all out before we did the event properly. And we do think that, you know, we would like to do it again and within existing budgets. And now we kind of know how to run it.
Am I online now? Can you hear me?
You're back in the room. Sorry, Catherine, I muted you earlier.
Right. I was just wondering what sort of input you had from the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalists, and whether any of them became volunteers and got engaged on a more long-time basis, because they're the people with the species knowledge and therefore can help with identification in the field and that sort of thing. And you know, I would hope that this sort of event, which sounds brilliant, would work to engage some of them on a more regular basis. Because I don't know about Norfolk now, I've lost track a bit, but the Lincolnshire equivalent has field days where they go out and have meetings in the field and record species and so on. But it's not linked to any kind of, well, it is linked, some of it goes to the national database, but it's not involved in a permanent way like it would be at Gressenhall, linked to a museum that can hold the information and that sort of thing. And it seemed to me you've got those people who have an expert knowledge of various different species and so on, and they should be a good source of information and help.
Yeah, Ben.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, Rach. Yes, it's a really good question. And I can say that, yes, well, we did have a secret ulterior motive that we wanted Norfolk and Norwich Naturalists to start seeing the Environment Hub as a space that was for them. And so we were really hoping that would create an ongoing relationship. And so far it's been really great. We actually have, is it this Friday, Rachel? Is that right? Yes, this Friday. They are running a workshop for their members on the site, and we've had several of the county recorders come back and do their own collecting days under their own steam in their own time to take records. And we have a very good relationship with the public engagement side of the organisation, with getting them to come along to events now. So they attend our large scale events. We've just had Apple Day. We had them come along and run a stall for families. I would really love to see some of them become volunteers in the volunteer programme that we're putting together, and that is yet to be seen, but yeah, I've got my fingers crossed.
It's
That's
worthwhile
good.
mentioning they also ran a fungi foray, technically some of their members, although not under the guise of NNNS. They did very generously give their time and expertise to run a 2-hour fungi foray, which happened in late September. So we also, in terms of public engagement, are trying to make sure that that relationship grows too, because we recognise where there's an audience who would love to come to a fungi foray, there's also going to be some folks who would love to be able to do some moth trapping and listen to a Norfolk folk duo who just brought out a songbook inspired by British moths, just to name one of my future projects. So
Oh, good. That sounds good.
yeah, please come, Catherine. We'll have to make sure we can try and get you to attend.
Yeah, and NNS were really key for us because obviously, like Catherine says, they are the experts. I think we very much saw our role as sort of the bridge between the experts and the public. And, I think they really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to families and teenagers at one point about what they do and how they record things. But for some of them, it was a new experience, but I think they really enjoyed it in the end.
Yeah. They tend to stick to their own specialism.
Yeah, I think trying to convince some people that they could speak about species more generally than their own specialism took a bit of persuading, but obviously the level of questions that our 8-year-olds are asking tend to be okay. But yeah.
But you get people who are absolutely fascinated by bats, for example, and rescue bats and look after them and can identify every species from the sound it makes and all that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, one of them was spiders specifically and kind of insects. So yeah, definitely.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of knowledge. One person or one group of people can't possibly know it all. So you need to get other people who've got a specialist interest to contribute that knowledge to share with everybody else, don't you, if you can?
Exactly, yeah.
That's a very good point, Catherine. I think that anyone who's thinking of doing something like this, that's a really good way as well of selling it to naturalist societies, because if you can impress upon them the fact that they are possibly influencing the next generation of members of their society, it becomes really tangible for them. It's a way of keeping what they do alive.
And a lot of the recorders that I know, they're all in Lincolnshire at the moment, but they're not young people, so they need to get more youngsters involved to sort of build that continuity that you need if you're going to build up a proper register of species and environment. It's not a one-off thing. It's got to continue over a period, hasn't it?
It does. And we were also very lucky that our recorders, yes, a number of them were older members of our community, but also our youngest recorder technically on one of the habitat stations was 17. She was there with her mum, who is part of the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, so obviously it runs in the family, but she was there to be able to support the habitat station that was out on our chalk-fed waterway, the Wendling Beck, a small-scale beck or river. And we also had a couple of independent birders who were our kind of, wider generation, our peers, so like people in their early 30s who are very keen and proud twitchers and love to get out there, but also could model that to say, okay, this person who I wouldn't expect is actually really into birding, and it models it in a different way than obviously what can sometimes feel generationally like a bit of a chasmic difference of like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to want to do when I'm in my 40s or my 50s or my 60s or beyond. But actually to see 17-year-old getting really excited about water-based invertebrates and a 30-year-old guy wearing a similar cool hat like Ben, it just kind of broke that down a little bit and made it feel inclusive, hopefully, in a way that people could see themselves reflected in the type of work we were trying to do and the type of opportunity that kind of exploration offers you.
Yeah, that's good.
Can I ask a question about the so you obviously wonderful opportunity to work with a new partner. Did you feel like you'd cracked the secondary school targeting that audience, or is that still something that is going to take a bit more to kind of develop further? And is there a formal schools option around this as well?
I can say, well, one thing we'd really like to do with volunteers is try and make it a opportunity that is as available for young people as possible. Now that's going to be tricky because of our location, but it's something I'd really like to work on. That said, I think it just drove home the fact that working with secondary schools is a long-term game, and the school that took up the most tickets was the school that I run a art school club with. So they know me, I see them almost every week, and they're far more likely to then talk about it in the classroom and pass it on to their peers, and the teachers are far more likely to talk about it. The other school that we don't have that ongoing relationship with had far smaller uptake, and yeah, so I'm afraid, yes, I think that we have cracked it insofar as we know what you need to do, but the thing you need to do is still incredibly intensive and long-term.
We did find that we luckily the pilots kind of highlighted this for us, is making sure that we had like an option that was appropriate for very young family members, kind of under 10s and even younger. So we had like a version of the sheet which was you could tick, and it had like easy read versions of kind of things you might find, and you could tick them, and that was great because maybe the parents or the older siblings would get, would do some of the kind of more high tech, has some intensive side of things, while the younger ones also got involved on a level that suited them. So it was good to have both options.
Does anyone else have any further thoughts, any experience from their own museums, their own sites, their own organisations they'd be happy to share?
Yeah, has anyone run a BioBlitz? I'd love to hear about anybody else's experience.
The Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust has run a very similar sort of thing at one of their nature reserves, where they've tried to get younger people involved very much in species recording, and they have workshops to help identify different species and that sort of thing. But I was wondering whether you got any involvement or tried to get any involvement from the farming community in this, or do they do their own thing on their land and aren't really bothered about?
That's a very, very good question. And I would say this was deliberately separate from that. And the reason for that is that because of our location next to the environment project, the Wendling Beck Environment Project,
yeah,
we do actually have regular what are called monitoring workshops, which are set up by the Wendling Beck Environment Project and open to landowners across the county, where they share sort of quite cutting edge strategies for monitoring on farmland. So we already have something going on that is quite sort of farming focused, and this was our opportunity to do something that's a bit more public facing.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
yeah. You do need
That
both.
project, it's like, you know, that I think that whole project is its own meeting as well, and not to try and sell Ben's time. But that has got multiple stakeholders, including the local Rivers Trust, you know, the Anglian Water. It's a really, really kind of complex grouping of people who have vested interest in where that project goes. And I think that the environmental side of it is really joyfully a huge, big focal point of it, which brings everyone else together. So despite the fact that one of the commonalities of it is it's farming land, as well as a few independent landowners who aren't necessarily working their land, the majority of what brings this kind of area together in the landowners in the local vicinity that are involved in that project, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, is that, you know, it is really rurally and farming based. So the fact that it's actually an environmental project that's the focus, and that's an additional thing they've got in common is the farming aspect, and that it's a nice way for our public engagement to also follow that in a way. We are known as Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse, but to centre the natural environment within that as a way in which to say, why wouldn't we, actually feels like a really natural thing to do, pun not intended. Yeah, just in terms of trying to reframe people's understanding or give them a different way to look at our site, to spotlight and platform our natural habitats and species, and to celebrate that and hopefully empower people to help us protect it.
Yeah, it is a challenge though, I think, being you know, making sure that those two things are always matching up, like the rural life side of things and the environment side of things. Of course, naturally they really do, but yeah, I think that's something we're always thinking about, is making sure that it doesn't become two separated things that the museum does. They're always integrated. A lot of Ben's work and the school's work specifically always kind of bring it back to the farming and the heritage farming specifically side of things. Yeah.
I was just going to say,
Conversations. You posted something really interesting on the chat there. I don't know if you could explain a bit more about the climate education link.
yeah, so I was going to say, so I'm involved because I'm at the University of Reading. I'm in the Museum of English Rural Life, so I've got kind of a couple of hats on, and I'm involved with the university's Education for Sustainable Development kind of working group, and this is I think that's an interesting opportunity working with universities, in terms of the work they're doing, but there's also kind of opportunities for kind of you know, getting scientists on site. So we have a program called, we do Our Green Stories, where we've got scientists coming in and doing tours. We also have Friday Fledglings, which is under 5 sessions, and these are not BioBlitz per se. This is working with forest school specialists, but also green explorers. And we've been kind of increasingly being asked to be involved in kind of climate festivals and things like that. So I think there's a really interesting side there. But yeah, Reading was involved in this kind of climate education action plan. They did a big workshop. I don't know whether they plan to do another one. But some of this is kind of now feeding through the Natural History Museum, and they're doing things where they're doing kind of BioBlitzes on school land via this national park program. And because we've got the partnership with the Natural History Museum, because their stores are coming in, like what I mean about different hats, they came and gave a talk to us the other day. So I think there's interesting things where people might be doing this in schools a bit more. So then there might be potential kind of links there, and I know the Natural History Museum is looking to reach out to people, so that's why I wanted to come and see, because I was kind of privy to a BioBlitz at Glastonbury Abbey when I was doing some work with them, but we haven't done it ourselves, and I was wondering some of the logistics, like for example being open 24 hours, and how you kind of place it out and what kind of resources you do, so you're not basically doing like a flat out 24-hour event. And it sounded like a really good idea.
I think in
relation
relation
to know
to
more about that, get in touch with me.
Yes, please.
Just what you're saying about the logistics of the 24-hour, I think we also had to be quite realistic about in our minds about we got lots of data and lots of data we can use, but our main aim, or like a big part of the aim was more about introducing to people to the concept of a BioBlitz and the concept of recording, whereas if our only aim was to get really good data of the site, we might have done it differently, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and one more thing with regards to the 24-hour thing. The only reason they suggest that is because obviously certain species are crepuscular or nocturnal. So it's as long as you go into it understanding that we're going to do it in the middle of the day, we're going to have a bit of a gap when it comes to nocturnal species and things like that. It really doesn't matter, because the data, if it's been verified and you know that that species is that species, that's valid data.
Absolutely. And just as a final note on it, we had the conversation on site to see if we could make it possible for instance, really early moth trapping happening. And again, just operationally, it wasn't going to work for us in terms of the additional staffing cost and also just the logistics of people being on site that early. But simultaneously, one thing that we then could kind of fill that gap with in terms of nocturnal species representation was some camera traps from Rachel's project for the 2023 exhibition about woodlands, where we'd set up camera traps in the woodland and captured lots of footage about various different species that our visitors obviously again wouldn't see otherwise. So again, when I was mentioning before about how we fill those gaps and make sure that there's enough to keep those very like visually stimulated people engaged, that was one of the first things they could see as they got to the orientation station. It's like, you won't see this because this is nighttime, but you can go to all these other stations and find all these other things. And just remember that there's going to be lots of different stuff for you to explore that is beyond, you know, the creepy crawly, the flying, the feathered, the slimy, the wet. It's going to be lots and lots of different options. Just maybe think differently about what you're expecting to see.
To think what time it is where you are.
Yeah,
Sorry, we missed that first bit.
I'm a curator at the Henry Ford, which is in Dearborn, Michigan. So I'm far removed from y'all, but very interested. I'm also the secretary for ICOM Sustain, which is the new Museums and Sustainable Development group. It was formally approved in March. And so the question has to do with the notion of regenerative agriculture and whether or not that farmer stewardship of spaces over time is part of this overall environment effort. And you probably addressed that, but I was so eager to learn more about your project as you talked that I was looking for your biodiversity plan and anyway, I didn't know if you're an ICOM member and how regenerative ag historically or today factors into this.
Oh, I feel like that's such a big question. We actually, just for context, we're about to lose one of our longest standing members of staff to retirement, who has been in situ in our farm, in situ, so that sounds so rude, like it's an exhibit. No, our farm officer, Richard, is about to retire after over 30 years in post next week. And he's responsible for so much, you know, progression of our farm over time. And there's lots of representation of how we as a rural life museum have, you know, still got engagement with historic heritage farming practices. One of our muck spreading demonstrations just went viral on Twitter through one of our visitors who got like 3 zillion views of people watching horse manure being spread with the horsepower itself and this fantastic piece of mechanics in use that's still obviously functional that most people wouldn't have seen ever in their lives. Sorry, just to get excited about that for a moment. I feel like that's the right audience to get excited about that with. But I can't speak, I don't actually know as the local authority museum whether or not we are an ICOM member, but I would hope that we might be. I feel like my museum masters was not so long ago that I've forgotten the acronym of ICOM. I feel like sometimes it can feel quite removed on occasion when you're working on a small, more granular scale on projects like this, to remember that we have so much to share with a wider and the larger conversation. Rachel as our curator might be better posed in terms of talking about the cultural heritage practice of how the farm as both a working entity and technically our animals as living collections factors in there. And also Ben is literally, his role is so environmentally focused, he's also going to be better posed. But I just jumped in because generally speaking, that's the type of conversation that is very exciting to hear, that it pricked your ears up. And if there is something we can have a conversation about outside of that, I would love to have it.
Can I ask, have you got anyone to replace dear Richard?
think recruitment is underway, so they're going to be hard boots to fill, shall we say?
Anyone
Very
wants to
hard.
apply, please do look.
I was going to say, I think it's closing very soon, and we've, tried to cast the net wide, or at least those been responsible for recruitment have.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
So I think Richard would be able to talk much better on this, but in terms of our farming practices then, so yeah, I mean, for really, Gressenhall has always sort of focused on, heritage farming and looking at farming practices, how they've changed over the last 200 years. So like you say, you can come and see heavy horses still being used. It's kind of life on a farm around the turn of the century, sort of 1930s is kind of how the farming practices there are run. For now, I guess for us now, that it's sort of turning that interest both as like looking at how heritage farming used to, was done, but also I guess what lessons we can learn from that now in terms of how we farm and how we treat the land and how we look at regenerative farming. It's not always to say that it's necessarily true that how it was done 100 years ago is better, but in that sense, but it's something, a story that we're trying to tell more, and Ben does that through outreach. And as Ben mentioned, and feel free to jump in, the Wendling Bet project, which is all about regenerative farming, is right on our doorstep. So we're looking at ways to link our site with theirs. It's all down to resources a lot of the time and budget, and like in terms of like the practical outcomes, like this interpretation that we've got here is a small but first step, and I'm sure in the future we'll be looking at how we can reinterpret some of those collections to focus on the heritage farming, but also look forward in terms of regenerative farming and what people are doing today, and make sure we keep collecting the things that kind of link with that.
Yeah, I'll just to add to that, and apologies if Fiona has already mentioned this. I was also busy responding to people in the chat about things, but we also have a program now slowly coming together of heritage landscape skills, I suppose. So hedge laying, scything. So those are available for people to book, and that's really about us trying to get people to think about learning from the past to manage spaces in a more environmentally friendly way. And as Rachel said, yeah, in terms of regenerative agriculture on a large scale, I think we're really, really interested to do more of that. But it's also about waiting for the right point and the right funding to help us do that in a really interesting way with the Wendling Bet project. They're still at very early stages, but what they're doing is fascinating, and they have been carrying out research with University of East Anglia to find out just how effective these practices are, and there's some amazing data coming out of the research showing that they are able to keep the same yield and hoover up huge amounts of carbon into the soil. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. I'm going to put my info in the chat just so you guys have it. But horse manure, I see this as a future topic too, because we've got a sustainability fella part-time, hopefully full-time eventually, who's studying composting horse manure, because we get pushback from composters who do not want it because of the residual pesticides, herbicides, whatever synthetics might, because of horse digestive system. So anyway, cool. Thank you.
I have a compost gal for you in LA, which is nowhere near Michigan, but she's leading a charge on compost in urban centres, which if you ever want that kind of connection, she's a fantastic expert just in my personal life, outside of my professional life. And I think that, compost is definitely the future, especially when we talk about even thinking about funerary practice, not to go bleak on a very importantly, lovely, joyful call. But yes, that compost is dear to my heart. We have master composters in Norfolk, and I would love to talk compost with you anytime. Please come for a field trip.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'll keep you posted when I'm back in the UK, and I'll send pounds to Hannah.
Please do. Please do.
And Rachel.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm conscious of the time, but equally don't want to cut short any conversations or sharing of resources. And there's fantastic discussions going on in the chat, but I will just gently call this to a close, and also just sort of add a little shameless plug at the end to say that on the 7th of November at 3 o'clock, we have one of our Rural Voices seminars, and that is exploring tackling the climate crisis with the power, and I'm assuming that's sustainable power or renewable, of rural museums. And that's the climate officer, Lucy Neville from Museums and Galleries Scotland, who will be leading that seminar. It's one that you need to book for, but there's all the links on the Royal Museums Network website, and I will share those as well. But it's all free for Royal Museum Network members, so I really hope you can join us. And I get the feeling that some of these topics may evolve into those conversations as well, so it'd be lovely to see you then. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Huge thanks to Rachel, to Fiona and to Ben from Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse to hearing about the BioBlitz event, but also how that works in their broader environmental work at Gressenhall. And thank you all for joining, and hope to see you at another Royal Museums Network event soon. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Anna.
sharing,
Thanks for
Anna.
having us.